In January of 1547, something unholy echoed through the corridors of Windsor Castle. It wasn't an explosion. It wasn't thunder. It was the sound of a body rejecting its own containment. The sealed lead coffin of King Henry VIII had ruptured from within. Decomposition gases, trapped for hours beneath soldered metal, had built enough force to split the casing apart. The stench hit first. A wall of sulfurous rot so thick that guards posted at the chapel entrance staggered backward, gasping, unable to hold their positions. When attendants finally gathered the nerve to re-enter, the scene waiting for them belonged in a nightmare. Stray dogs had found their way into the chapel through the unguarded doors. They were crouched low around the broken coffin, tongues dragging through the dark, viscous fluid leaking across the stone floor. The sovereign who had proclaimed himself supreme head of the Church of England, the man who bent an entire civilization to his will, was now nothing more than a meal for strays. This is not the version of Henry VIII you were taught. The textbooks give you a portrait of a powerful ruler who aged poorly, gained weight, and died surrounded by advisors. That is a curated lie. The reality was buried in physician reports that were never meant to survive, in diplomatic letters sealed with wax and fear, in personal journals hidden from Tudor censors for centuries. What those documents reveal is something the English crown spent over a decade trying to conceal. In 1536, during a jousting tournament at Greenwich Palace, Henry was thrown from his horse. The armored stallion collapsed on top of him. He lay unconscious for 2 full hours. The young athletic prince the world had admired never opened his eyes again. The man who eventually woke up was someone else entirely. Something had broken inside his skull. His personality shifted. His body began a slow, irreversible collapse. A festering wound on his leg opened and never closed again, filling his chambers with the smell of dying tissue. For the next 11 years, England was ruled by a man whose flesh was actively decaying while he still drew breath. His court knew it. His doctors knew it. His wives certainly knew it. And every single one of them was forced into silence under penalty of death. What played out behind the sealed doors of Whitehall Palace was not governance. It was the desperate performance of a nation pretending its king was not decomposing on the throne. Now we pull back that curtain. Every hidden record, every suppressed medical detail, every moment his closest advisors prayed the world would never discover. Drop your city and country in the comments. Subscribe if you haven't already, and help this channel grow. You're watching Ancestral, the best dark history channel in the world. The date was January 24th, 1536. The ground at Greenwich Palace could have cracked bone on contact. A deep winter frost had turned the tilt yard into something closer to stone than soil. King Henry VIII sat mounted on a destrier, a breed of war horse engineered for violence. The animal alone carried 1,500 pounds of raw muscle and momentum. Strapped to Henry's body was 60 pounds of custom-forged steel plate armor, every joint articulated, every surface polished to deflect a killing blow. He lowered his visor. He locked his lance. He kicked the destrier forward. On the opposite end of the list, his opponent did the same. Both riders accelerated to full gallop, 15 miles per hour from each direction. The closing speed between them was savage. The wooden lance did not skip across the surface of the king's shield. It connected clean. The full force of a mounted cavalry charge transferred directly into his chest. Henry was ripped backward out of his saddle and launched into the frozen air. His back hit the ground first. The impact alone would have been devastating. But the nightmare was just beginning. His destrier, startled by the collision, lost its footing. 1,500 pounds of panicked war horse buckled forward and came crashing down directly onto the body of the King of England. Half a ton of thrashing animal, iron horseshoes, and armored steel drove Henry deep into the frozen earth. His helmeted skull smashed against the rock-hard ground with tremendous force. And inside that helmet, something catastrophic happened. Modern neuroscience has a name for it: coup contre coup injury. When the skull decelerates violently, the brain does not stop moving. It slams forward against the interior wall of the cranium. Then it rebounds. It smashes backward against the opposite wall. The effect is like shaking a raw egg inside its shell. Microscopic networks of axons, the delicate wiring that connects thought to action, shredded apart. Capillaries burst open like crushed berries. Blood began pooling silently against the soft tissue of his brain. The damage was invisible. It was also irreversible. The tilt yard fell completely silent. No one moved for a long, horrifying moment. Then guards broke into a sprint across the frost. They seized the thrashing horse by the reins and hauled the massive animal off the king's body. Henry lay motionless in the dirt. They fumbled with the buckles of his visor and wrenched it open. His eyes were shut. His breathing was barely detectable. A deep gash had opened across his thigh where the edge of his own armor had been driven into his flesh by the weight of the horse. Blood was soaking into the frozen ground beneath him. Courtiers lifted his limp body and carried him in silence through the corridors of Greenwich Palace. The doors to the royal apartments were sealed behind them. Inside, panic erupted. Members of the Privy Council paced the room with ashen faces. England had no legitimate male heir. Queen Anne Boleyn was carrying a child, but the pregnancy was fragile. If the king died on that table, the Tudor line would collapse before sunset. The country would fracture. Civil war would consume every corner of the realm. And there was nothing anyone in that room could do to stop it. The royal physicians gathered around the bed. They were the most educated medical minds in England. They were also completely useless. Their understanding of the human body was rooted in the ancient theory of humors, a system that blamed disease on imbalances of blood, bile, phlegm, and black bile. They had no concept of intracranial pressure. They could not measure the hemorrhage spreading silently inside the king's skull. They pressed leeches against his temples. They burned bundles of dried herbs near his nostrils. They muttered prayers in Latin. And then they waited, because waiting was the only tool they actually possessed. For 2 full hours, the King of England did not open his eyes. The court held its breath. Ministers whispered in corners. Messengers were held at the gates so no word could escape the palace walls. Every second that passed without the king regaining consciousness pushed the nation closer to the edge. 2 hours in a coma, in the 16th century, with no monitoring equipment, no oxygen support, no understanding of what was happening inside the injured brain. 2 hours of absolute darkness behind closed eyelids, while the most powerful throne in Europe sat empty. And then he woke up. His eyes opened. He looked at the ceiling. Physicians rushed to his bedside. Courtiers exhaled. The kingdom, for the moment, was saved. But the man staring up at the vaulted beams of Greenwich Palace was not the same man who had climbed onto that horse. The Renaissance prince was gone. The golden boy who had dazzled the courts of Europe, who composed liturgical music and debated theology with Thomas More, who wrote love poetry in French and could wrestle any nobleman in his court to the ground. That man had died in the frozen dirt of the tilt yard. He never came back. Something else opened its eyes in that bed. something damaged, something dangerous. The frontal lobe of the human brain is the architecture of civilized behavior. It is the region responsible for impulse control, for empathy, for the ability to pause before acting, to weigh consequences, to feel the weight of another person's suffering. It is, in the simplest terms, the part of the brain that separates a rational human being from a predator. The catastrophic force of the horse landing on Henry's skull had crushed the neural tissue in this region beyond any possibility of repair. The pathways that once allowed him to show mercy, to forgive, to hesitate before destroying a life, those pathways were now dead circuits, biologically erased, permanently offline. Henry VIII was now, by every modern clinical definition, a functioning sociopath, and he was still the most powerful man on the planet. The transformation was not gradual. It was instantaneous. His temper, once sharp but manageable, became volcanic and unpredictable. Blinding headaches seized him without warning, leaving him screaming in darkened rooms for hours. The smallest disagreement, a wrong word from a servant, a poorly prepared dish, a glance held too long, could trigger an eruption of rage so violent that grown men fled the room in terror. The athletic body that had once dominated every tournament in England was now a broken vessel, and the wound on his leg refused to heal. Fragments of shattered bone remained trapped beneath the skin and muscle. Every single step he took for the remaining 11 years of his life sent a bolt of white-hot agony shooting from his thigh, up through his spine, and into the base of his damaged skull. The pain never stopped. Not for 1 hour. Not for 1 minute. It fed his fury like kindling feeds a fire. And the brain damage had removed every mechanism he once had to contain it. 5 days after the accident, Anne Boleyn miscarried. The child was male. Before the jousting accident, Henry had set the entire European continent on fire for this woman. He had defied the Pope himself. He had ripped England away from the Catholic Church, an institution that had governed the spiritual life of the nation for 1,000 years. He had excommunicated his own country from the body of Christendom. He had destroyed his first marriage, humiliated Catherine of Aragon, severed ties with the Holy Roman Emperor, and turned himself into a heretic in the eyes of half the known world. All for Anne. Every political bridge he burned, every alliance he shattered, every tradition he demolished. It was all done to place Anne Boleyn at his side and produce a male heir. Now his damaged brain looked at her and felt nothing, less than nothing. He felt revulsion. The neural circuits that had once processed love, attachment, and loyalty were destroyed tissue. He could not access the memory of why he had wanted her. All he could feel was a cold, mechanical disgust. He did not grieve the lost child. He did not comfort his wife. Instead, his fractured mind reached for the only explanation that made sense to a man incapable of processing complex emotion. She had bewitched him. It was sorcery. Dark magic. That was the only reason he could have ever wanted her. Within 4 months, Anne Boleyn was arrested. The charges were a masterpiece of fabricated horror. Treason, adultery with 5 different men, incest with her own brother, George Boleyn. Every accusation was a lie engineered by Thomas Cromwell under the king's direct orders. Men who had done nothing more than speak politely to the Queen were dragged into the dungeons beneath the Tower of London. They were strapped to the rack. Their joints were pulled apart inch by inch until the agony broke their minds, and they confessed to whatever their torturers demanded. The king did not want an annulment. He did not want a quiet separation. He wanted her destroyed. He wanted her name erased from the record of his reign. He wanted blood on the scaffold. This was not politics. This was the first visible symptom of a brain that could no longer distinguish between governance and slaughter. Empathy requires a functioning frontal lobe. Henry's was rotting inside his skull. On May 19, 1536, Anne Boleyn was escorted to the scaffold erected within the walls of the Tower of London. A small crowd of officials and courtiers had gathered to witness the execution. She walked with extraordinary composure. She knelt in the straw that had been spread across the wooden platform. The executioner was not English. He had been specially imported from Saint-Omer in northern France, a professional swordsman renowned for the precision of his work. He carried a heavy two-handed blade instead of the standard axe. He had concealed it in the straw behind Anne so she would not see it, so her body would not tense, so the cut would be clean. Anne began to pray. Her lips moved quietly. Her eyes were open. The swordsman stepped forward without warning and swung the blade in a single fluid arc. The steel passed through her cervical vertebrae with almost no resistance. Her head separated from her body and dropped onto the wooden planks. Witnesses later reported that her eyes continued to move, darting back and forth across the courtyard for several seconds after the blade fell. The human brain can survive briefly on residual oxygen even after decapitation. Anne Boleyn's final conscious experience was watching the world tilt sideways as her severed head rolled across the scaffold floor. At the exact moment the cannon fired from the tower to signal the execution was complete, Henry VIII was on a tennis court. He heard the blast. He registered its meaning. His wife was dead. He did not pause. He did not lower his racket. He finished his serve and continued the game. The court understood the signal. This was no longer a monarchy governed by law and counsel. The men who surrounded the king realized, with a terror that settled into their bones, that they were not advising a ruler. They were trapped inside a palace with an unmedicated, undiagnosed, neurologically destroyed predator who held the power of life and death over every person in England. Paranoia became the default state of the Tudor court. No one spoke freely. No one made eye contact for too long. Every word uttered within the walls of Whitehall was measured against a single question. Could this sentence get me killed? Henry began executing people for the crime of thinking about his death. Not plotting against him, not conspiring, simply imagining or being accused of imagining a future in which the king was no longer alive. It was codified into law. The Treason Act made it a capital offense to speak of the king's health, to speculate about his death, or to discuss the succession. If a courtier whispered to a friend that the king looked unwell, that courtier could be dragged to the execution grounds at Tyburn, hanged until nearly dead, cut down while still breathing, disemboweled in front of the crowd, and finally hacked into 4 pieces. The king had turned speech itself into a death sentence. Later that same year, the north of England erupted. Tens of thousands of citizens rose up in what became known as the Pilgrimage of Grace. They were not revolutionaries. They were ordinary people, farmers, monks, parish priests, small landowners who were horrified by Henry's destruction of the monasteries and the wholesale dismantling of the Catholic faith that had structured their lives for generations. They marched under banners of the 5 wounds of Christ. They demanded negotiation. They believed their king would listen. The Henry who existed before the jousting field might have listened. He might have calculated the political cost of compromise and found a path that preserved both his authority and the peace. That Henry was dead. The brain-damaged Henry, who now sat on the throne, chose a different strategy. He sent word to the rebel leaders that he was willing to talk. He offered pardons. He invited their commanders to London. He greeted them warmly. He shook their hands and promised that no harm would come to them or their followers. Then he broke every single promise he had made. He dispatched his generals north with explicit orders to make examples. Over 200 people were executed. Monks were ripped from the abbeys they had served for decades. They were dragged through the streets of their own villages. They were hung in iron chains from the outer walls of their own monasteries and left there. Henry gave specific instructions that the bodies were not to be taken down. He wanted them to hang in the open air until decomposition did its work, until the flesh blackened and split, until the bones began to separate and fall to the ground in pieces. He wanted every citizen in northern England to smell the rotting remains of their spiritual leaders every single time they walked to the market square, every time they opened a window, every time they drew a breath. The king was not simply punishing rebellion. He was weaponizing decay itself, and while he turned the corpses of priests into instruments of terror, his own body was beginning the same process from the inside out. Because Henry could no longer ride, because he could no longer hunt or wrestle, or walk the grounds of his palaces without assistance, because the leg wound kept him seated, immobile, and raging in his chambers, his caloric intake became grotesque. The royal kitchens prepared feasts for a man who could barely stand. He consumed an estimated 5,000 calories every single day. Platters of roasted venison, whole capons, joints of beef, pork pies layered with butter, towers of sugar-sculpted desserts, heavy goblets of spiced wine poured one after another from morning until he finally passed out at night. His body had no way to burn any of it. His waistline, once a trim 32 inches in his prime, expanded to 54 inches. His weight climbed past 300 pounds. Then it kept climbing. By the final years of his reign, historical estimates place him at over 400 pounds. He could no longer navigate stairs. His legs could barely support his own mass. His household servants were forced to engineer crude mechanical devices, wooden platforms equipped with thick ropes and heavy pulleys, just to hoist the king's body from one floor to the next. The physical infrastructure of the English monarchy was being redesigned in real time to maintain the illusion that the king was still a functioning human being. The floors of his palaces had to be reinforced so they would not collapse beneath him. Doorways were widened so his body could pass through. The entire apparatus of the state was bending the laws of engineering and physics to keep one rotting man on a throne he could no longer reach without a machine. But the structural renovations could not keep pace with the structural collapse happening inside his skull. His mind continued to fracture. His paranoia deepened. His cruelty sharpened. And his next target was the one man who had made the entire Tudor machine possible: Thomas Cromwell. Cromwell was not simply a minister. He was the architect of everything Henry had built since the break with Rome. He had engineered the legal framework for the English Reformation. He had orchestrated the dissolution of the monasteries and funneled their vast wealth into the royal treasury. He had destroyed Henry's enemies with surgical precision. He had managed the king's rages, absorbed his cruelty, and kept the machinery of government turning through years of chaos. He was, by any rational measure, the most effective and most loyal servant the English crown had ever employed. His crime was a failed marriage arrangement. Cromwell had negotiated a political union between Henry and Anne of Cleves, a German noblewoman whose alliance would have strengthened England's position against Catholic Europe. When Henry met her in person, he was repulsed. Whether his reaction was rooted in genuine displeasure or in the irrational emotional processing of a damaged brain is a question historians still debate. What is not debatable is what happened next. Henry did not dismiss Cromwell from service. He did not strip his title and send him to the country. He annihilated him. Armed guards marched into the Privy Council chamber without warning. They seized Cromwell by the collar. They ripped the chain of office from his neck in front of his peers. He was dragged through the corridors of the palace and thrown into a cell in the Tower of London. There was no trial worthy of the name. There was no opportunity to mount a defense. The man who had built the king's empire was treated like a stray animal being hauled to the pit. On July 28, 1540, Thomas Cromwell was led to the scaffold on Tower Hill. The king had made one final, deliberate decision regarding the execution. He did not assign a professional headsman. He chose an inexperienced executioner. Whether this was intentional cruelty or bureaucratic indifference, the result was the same. The executioner raised the axe. The blade was dull. He brought it down and struck the back of Cromwell's skull instead of his neck. Cromwell screamed. Blood erupted across the wooden block. The executioner, visibly shaking, raised the axe again and swung. The second blow hit Cromwell's shoulder. The man was still alive, still conscious, still feeling everything. The executioner hacked at his neck again and again. Contemporary accounts suggest it took more than 3 full strikes to finally sever the head from the body. The scaffold was drenched in blood. The crowd watched in stunned silence as one of the most powerful men in England was butchered like livestock. At the exact hour that Thomas Cromwell's body was being carried away in pieces, King Henry VIII was standing in his chambers being dressed in his wedding clothes. He married his 5th wife, Catherine Howard, on the same day, the same afternoon. There was no strategic calculation behind the timing. There was no political message being sent. It was the raw, unfiltered behavior of a neurologically shattered mind. Satisfy the impulse. Destroy the irritation. Move to the next sensation. The king's brain was no longer capable of processing consequence, guilt, or the passage of time in any meaningful way. Cromwell's blood was still wet on the scaffold wood, while Henry exchanged vows with a teenage girl. If you are still watching this, you already know that the history you were taught in school was incomplete. It was cleaned. It was softened. It was made digestible. That is not what we do here. We go into the sealed archives. We pull the suppressed records. We tell you what actually happened, without flinching, without apology, without compromise. But none of that is possible without your direct support. I want to personally invite you to join The Lineage, our channel membership. This is not a donation box. This is an inner circle. When you join, you become part of the team that keeps this channel alive and independent. Members get early access to our most intense investigations before anyone else sees them. They get behind-the-scenes content. They get a direct voice in what stories we cover next. If this channel matters to you, click the join button below this video right now. Become part of the lineage. Now let us return to the rotting king. The scaffold blood dried. The severed heads were mounted on iron spikes above the southern gatehouse of London Bridge, where they would remain until the weather and the birds reduced them to bare skulls. But the absolute dominion Henry exercised over every living person in England could not extend to the rebellion happening inside his own body. The wound on his leg had evolved into something far worse than a simple injury. The original trauma from the jousting accident had triggered a condition that modern medicine identifies as chronic osteomyelitis. The bone marrow deep inside his femur had become infected with bacteria. In the 16th century, there were no antibiotics. There was no concept of bacterial infection. There was no way to reach the source of the disease. The body's immune system, left entirely on its own, attempted to fight the infection the only way it knew how. It tried to push the dead and dying tissue outward, away from the bone, toward the surface of the skin. The result was devastating. Massive ulcers erupted across the surface of both legs. They began as swollen, angry patches of inflamed skin and rapidly expanded into open, cratered wounds the size of a man's fist. The tissue around them turned black as the flesh died. The skin split apart under the pressure of the infection beneath it, and from those open wounds, a constant, unending stream of fluid poured out. Yellow pus, greenish discharge streaked with dead tissue, dark brown fluid carrying fragments of necrotic bone. The drainage never stopped. It soaked through every bandage. It saturated every layer of linen wrapped around his legs. It pooled in his boots. It dripped onto the floors of whatever room he occupied. The pain was beyond anything the 16th century had a framework to describe. There were no painkillers, no morphine, no anesthesia of any kind. The king screamed. He screamed for hours in his darkened chambers while his attendants stood frozen outside the door, terrified to enter, terrified to leave. The agony was relentless. It did not peak and subside. It was a constant, grinding, burning pressure that radiated from the infected bone outward through every nerve in his lower body and fed directly into a brain already shattered by trauma. Pain and rage became indistinguishable. His suffering made him more dangerous, not less. Every single morning, the royal physicians had to enter the king's private chambers and perform a procedure that would have tested the nerve of a battlefield surgeon. They carried bronze bowls and lengths of clean linen. They knelt before the most volatile and dangerous man in England. And they squeezed. They pressed their hands into the swollen, blackened, rotting flesh of his thighs and manually forced the infected fluid out of the ulcers and into the waiting bowls. They wiped away ribbons of dead tissue with their bare hands. They probed the edges of the wounds to check whether the infection had spread deeper overnight. There was no anesthesia to dull what they were doing. The king felt every ounce of pressure, every scrape, every moment of contact with the raw, exposed nerve endings beneath his destroyed skin. One involuntary flinch from a physician, one moment of hesitation that caused the king a single extra second of pain, could be interpreted as incompetence, or worse, as deliberate harm. And in Henry's court, that interpretation carried a death sentence. But the physical agony of the drainage was not the worst element of the king's condition. The worst part was invisible. It traveled through the air. The infection produced a smell that witnesses described in terms usually reserved for the battlefield dead. It was the smell of active decomposition, of flesh that was dying and liquefying while the host was still alive. The odor saturated everything. It seeped into Henry's clothing and could not be washed out. It soaked into the velvet cushions of his throne and lingered for hours after he had been carried away. It permeated the curtains, the tapestries, the wooden paneling of every room he entered. Courtiers reported that you could detect the presence of the king from 3 full rooms away. The stench preceded him like an invisible herald. Before you heard his voice, before you saw his massive frame being carried or wheeled into the chamber, you smelled him. And the smell was the smell of a man whose body was decomposing from the inside while his heart still beat. The Privy Council now faced a problem that threatened the survival of the English state itself. The entire foundation of Tudor power rested on a single, fragile illusion that the king was strong, divinely chosen, and physically capable of ruling. The monarch's body was not merely a body, it was a symbol, a projection of God's favor. If the people of England, or worse, the courts of Europe, discovered that their king was an immobile, brain-damaged, 400-pound figure whose legs were rotting open and whose chambers smelled like a crypt, the consequences would be immediate and catastrophic. Rebellions would erupt. Foreign powers would smell weakness and mobilize. The fragile religious settlement that held the country together would shatter overnight. So the Privy Council did what every desperate government does when the truth becomes an existential threat. They buried it. They launched one of the most elaborate cover-up operations in the history of the English monarchy. The royal palaces were physically restructured to accommodate the lie. Doorways were widened not for comfort, but so that the king's increasingly massive body could be moved without witnesses seeing him struggle. Floorboards were reinforced not for safety, but so the sound of creaking timber would not betray his weight. Entire corridors were rerouted so that Henry could be transported between rooms without passing through public spaces. The architecture of power was literally rebuilt around the decaying body of one man. But all the construction in the world could not stop what was happening beneath his skin. The infection was moving deeper. Day by day, the bacteria were consuming more tissue, pressing closer to the thin wall of blood vessels that separated the localized rot in his legs from his circulatory system. The physicians knew what would happen if that barrier failed. The moment the bacteria entered his bloodstream, the infection would no longer be contained. It would become systemic. It would reach his organs, his kidneys, his liver, his brain. And once that happened, there was no force on earth, no prayer, no poultice, no act of royal will that could stop the cascade. In the final winter of Henry's life, the barrier broke. The human femur is an engineering marvel of the natural world. It is the longest, densest, and strongest bone in the human body, capable of bearing thousands of pounds of force per square inch. It sits encased in thick sheaths of muscle, connective tissue, and fat, insulated from the outside world like a vault buried beneath layers of armor. Deep inside the calcium walls of that bone lies the marrow cavity, a sealed, sterile environment where the body manufactures its blood cells. In a healthy human being, nothing from the outside world ever touches this space. It is one of the most protected regions in the entire body. On January 24, 1536, that vault was breached. When the destrier collapsed onto Henry's body in the frozen tilt yard at Greenwich Palace, the force of the impact drove fragments of contaminated material deep into his thigh. Whether it was a shard of his own armor, twisted inward by the weight of the horse, or a splinter from the shattered jousting lance, or a combination of both, the result was identical. Something foreign punctured through skin, through muscle, through the periosteum surrounding the bone, and penetrated into the marrow cavity itself. And riding on the surface of that fragment were microscopic passengers, bacteria, organisms from the dirt of the tilt yard, from the surface of the unwashed armor, from the sweat and grime of a 16th century sporting ground where horses defecated and men bled on a regular basis. Those bacteria entered the warm, nutrient-rich darkness of the king's bone marrow, and they began to multiply. In the marrow cavity, conditions were perfect for colonization: warmth, moisture, an endless supply of organic material to consume. The bacteria fed on the living tissue. They reproduced at exponential rates, doubling their population every 20 to 30 minutes. Within hours, millions of microscopic organisms were devouring the interior of the king's femur from the inside out, and the king's body, lacking any concept of what was happening at the microscopic level, launched the only defense it had. The immune system deployed waves of white blood cells into the marrow cavity. These cells attacked the bacteria with chemical weapons, engulfing the invaders and destroying them. But the battle produced collateral damage on a massive scale. Dead bacteria, dead white blood cells, destroyed tissue, fragments of dissolved bone. All of this accumulated into a thick, toxic sludge of necrotic material that had absolutely nowhere to go. The marrow cavity is a rigid, enclosed space. It cannot expand. The pressure inside the king's thigh bone began to build. Day after day, week after week, month after month. The infection and the immune response ground against each other in a war of attrition that neither side could win. This condition is what modern medicine calls chronic osteomyelitis. It is one of the most painful and persistent bone infections known to medical science. Even today, with access to intravenous antibiotics, surgical debridement, and advanced imaging technology, chronic osteomyelitis remains extraordinarily difficult to treat. In the 16th century, it was a death sentence written in slow motion. Eventually, the pressure inside the bone became too great for the calcium walls to contain. The infection began eating through the bone itself. Microscopic tunnels formed in the hard tissue, channels bored by bacterial enzymes dissolving the mineral structure of the femur. The infection pushed outward through these channels and entered the surrounding muscle. It dissolved the connective tissue. It liquefied the subcutaneous fat. It carved pathways through the deep layers of his leg like underground rivers, eroding the earth above them. And finally, after months of invisible destruction, the infection reached the surface. The skin of Henry's legs ruptured. Fistulas opened on both thighs. These were not clean surgical incisions. They were ragged, volcanic eruptions of diseased tissue, holes torn open from the inside by the sheer hydraulic pressure of the infection forcing its way out. The body was using these openings as exhaust vents, the only mechanism it had to relieve the unbearable pressure building inside the bone. Through these fistulas, the necrotic contents of the marrow cavity began to drain. The ulcers expanded rapidly. Within weeks, each wound had grown to the size of a man's clenched fist. The edges of the openings hardened and turned black as the surrounding skin tissue died from constant exposure to the toxic discharge. The center of each ulcer remained open, raw, glistening with exposed subcutaneous tissue, and weeping a continuous, unending stream of fluid. The exudate was thick and viscous. Yellow pus formed the base layer. The remnants of the immune system's failed assault. Greenish bacterial waste streaked through it, carrying the metabolic byproducts of millions of living organisms still consuming his flesh. Dark brown clotted blood mixed in, the remnants of ruptured capillaries destroyed by the advancing infection. This fluid did not stop flowing. It dripped constantly, soaking through every bandage applied, saturating the linen wraps within minutes of being changed. It pooled in his stockings. It stained every surface he sat upon. The pain was not episodic. It did not come in waves. It was mechanical and absolute. Every time the king shifted his weight, even slightly, the fractured, infected segments of bone inside his thigh ground against the inflamed, swollen muscle surrounding them. The sensation was the equivalent of having a broken shard of glass embedded inside your leg and being forced to walk on it without relief, without medication, without any hope that it would ever stop. The 16th century had no understanding of nerve block procedures, no opiate derivatives refined for medical use, no anesthesia of any kind. The strongest analgesic available to Henry was heavily spiced wine, which he consumed in enormous quantities. It dulled the edges of his consciousness. It did absolutely nothing to address the source of the pain. The King of England spent his nights with his face buried in velvet pillows, screaming until his voice gave out, while his attendants stood on the other side of the locked door and listened in frozen silence. By 1540, the daily medical procedure required to maintain the king's legs had become one of the most dangerous jobs in England. Each morning at dawn, the royal physicians assembled outside the king's bedchamber. They carried bronze drainage bowls, stacks of raw linen, and small instruments for scraping dead tissue. They entered the room knowing that every second of the next hour would be a negotiation between medical necessity and personal survival. The king's neurological damage had obliterated his capacity for stoic endurance. The frontal lobe injuries from the jousting accident had stripped away every layer of emotional regulation he had once possessed. He could not grit his teeth and bear it. He could not rationalize the pain as temporary. He experienced every touch on his damaged legs as an act of aggression, and he responded with the only tools his broken brain still had access to: rage and threats of lethal violence. The physicians knelt before him. They unwrapped the soiled bandages, peeling away layers of linen that had fused overnight to the edges of the open wounds. Then they placed their hands on the swollen, discolored flesh of his thighs and pressed. They squeezed the blackened tissue surrounding each ulcer, forcing the trapped pus and necrotic fluid up through the fistulas and into the waiting bowls. The thick discharge spilled over their fingers. They scraped the dead tissue from the wound margins with small blades, removing the layers of dying skin that accumulated daily as the infection continued to consume him from within. They did all of this without any form of anesthesia, while the most powerful and most dangerous man in England thrashed on the mattress beneath their hands. Henry struck his doctors. He struck them with his fists when the pain spiked. He screamed threats of execution into their faces while they worked. He told them he would have their heads mounted on the gates of the tower if they caused him one more moment of unnecessary suffering. And the physicians knew with absolute certainty that these were not empty threats delivered in the heat of the moment. They had watched this man execute 2 of his own wives. They had watched him send his most loyal minister to a botched beheading. They had seen men dragged from this very palace to die at Tyburn for offenses as minor as speaking the wrong word at the wrong time. The doctors cleaned the rotting legs of the king with hands that visibly trembled. Every morning, every single day, for years. But the physical horror of the drainage ritual was only half of the ordeal that defined life in Henry's inner court. The other half was invisible. It traveled through the air, and it was, by every surviving account, worse than the sight of the wounds themselves. The smell. Infected human bone marrow produces a very specific odor when it begins to decompose. It is a sharp, metallic stench, frequently compared to copper or old pennies, layered beneath a deep organic rot that resembles raw sewage left to ferment in an enclosed space. This was not a faint odor, detectable only at close range. This was a smell that radiated from the king's body every hour of every day without interruption. It had saturated the heavy wool of his doublet so thoroughly that his clothing carried the stench even when he was not wearing it. It had soaked into the velvet cushions of every chair and throne he sat upon. It clung to the tapestries hanging on the walls of his private chambers. It permeated the wooden paneling, the floor rushes, the bed curtains. Visitors to the king's apartments reported that you could detect the monarch's presence from 3 full rooms away. The stench preceded him through the corridors of Whitehall like an invisible advance guard. Before you heard his voice echoing off the stone walls, before the heavy tread of his attendants announced his approach, the smell arrived. And the smell was the smell of a human being whose interior was actively liquefying while his exterior still breathed and spoke and issued commands. The Privy Council recognized that the king's medical condition had escalated from a personal health crisis into a geopolitical emergency. The entire political architecture of 16th-century monarchy rested on a single foundational myth. The king's body was sacred, inviolable, chosen by God, and physically superior to the bodies of ordinary men. The monarch was not merely a political leader. He was the living incarnation of divine authority on earth. His body was the state, If the ambassadors of France reported to King Francis that the English sovereign was a 400-pound cripple whose legs were rotting open and whose chambers reeked of death, it would not merely be humiliating, it would be an invitation. French armies would mobilize. The Holy Roman Emperor would sense vulnerability. Catholic powers across Europe would see an opportunity to reclaim England for Rome. Domestically, every nobleman with a drop of Plantagenet blood would begin calculating his own path to the throne. The country would tear itself apart. The Privy Council could not cure the king, so they did the only thing they could. They built an elaborate, multi-layered system of deception designed to hide the biological reality of Henry's body from every person who did not absolutely need to know. The first problem was his size. Because his destroyed legs prevented any form of exercise, and because his brain damage had eliminated any capacity for dietary self-regulation, his body had become a monument to unchecked consumption. He weighed nearly 400 pounds. His waist had expanded to 54 inches. The standard doorways of the Tudor palaces, built for men half his width, could no longer accommodate his passage without an undignified struggle that would have been visible to any servant or courtier in the corridor. The solution was architectural. Carpenters were brought into Whitehall Palace and Hampton Court under cover of darkness. Working through the night, they dismantled solid oak door frames that had stood for decades and rebuilt them to wider specifications. They reinforced the floorboards beneath with additional layers of timber and cross-bracing so that the wood would not audibly groan under the king's immense weight as he passed. Every modification was completed before dawn. Every carpenter was sworn to silence under threat of the Treason Act. The second problem was mobility. Henry could no longer walk unassisted for any meaningful distance. His legs could not support his mass, and the pain from the infected bone made every step an act of excruciating will. The state needed him to appear in galleries, in audience chambers, in the spaces where power was performed and witnessed. Engineers were commissioned to build a device. It was a heavy wooden chair mounted on a system of iron wheels and mechanical gears. It allowed the king to be moved through the private corridors of the palace without requiring him to stand. This device, one of the earliest functioning wheelchairs in recorded European history, was classified as a state secret. Only the king's most trusted personal guards were permitted to see it. Only a handful of servants were authorized to operate it. If any member of the household mentioned the existence of the rolling chair to anyone outside the inner circle, they faced prosecution under the Treason Act. The penalty was death. For vertical movement between floors, the engineers constructed a block-and-tackle hoisting system. A heavy leather harness was strapped around the king's torso. Thick ropes ran from the harness up through a series of pulleys mounted to the ceiling beams of the stairwell. On the upper landing, teams of strong yeomen of the guard took hold of the ropes and hauled. The King of England, the supreme head of the church, the man who had remade the religious and political landscape of an entire continent, was lifted into the air like a crate of cargo being loaded onto a merchant ship. He dangled in the harness, his massive body swaying, the infected fluid from his legs dripping steadily down onto the stairs below him, while servants waited at the bottom with rags to wipe the steps clean before anyone else could see the stains. The visual deception was exhaustive, but the olfactory deception was an even greater challenge. The smell of the king's rotting body could not be concealed with linen wraps or wider doors. It required chemical warfare. The crown allocated enormous sums from the royal treasury to procure the rarest and most powerful aromatics available in the 16th century world. Ambergris, a waxy substance produced in the digestive tract of sperm whales, was imported at staggering cost from trading posts along the Indian Ocean. It was burned in heavy brass braziers, positioned in every room the king was scheduled to enter. The substance produced a thick, musky smoke designed to overpower the smell of decomposition. Servants walked ahead of the king's procession through the corridors, spraying concentrated rose water onto the walls, the floors, and the tapestries. Pages carried pomanders, small perforated metal spheres stuffed with cloves, cinnamon bark, dried orange peel, and camphor, which they held beneath their noses and waved through the air as the king passed. The combined effect was not a pleasant fragrance masking an unpleasant one. It was a chemical collision. The heavy, sweet floral notes of the rose water and the deep animal musk of the burning ambergris merged with the sharp, metallic rot emanating from the king's open wounds and created something entirely new, a suffocating, layered stench that was simultaneously sweet and putrid, floral and cadaverous. It triggered immediate physical reactions in anyone who entered the space unprepared. Servants who had worked in the palace for years learned to hold their breath for as long as possible when entering the king's wing. New pages assigned to deliver meals or messages frequently vomited in the dark corners of the hallways within minutes of their first exposure. The entire court, from the highest-ranking duke to the lowest kitchen boy, existed in a state of perpetual sensory assault, breathing through their mouths, averting their faces, and pretending that nothing was wrong. The neurological damage from the jousting accident transformed the interior of the palace into something closer to a psychological combat zone than a seat of government. Henry's moods did not shift gradually. They detonated. The destroyed frontal lobe tissue meant that his emotional state could swing from expansive, almost manic generosity to homicidal paranoia within the span of a single conversation. A minister could enter the king's presence with a routine administrative request and leave the room with a new title and a grant of land. Or the same minister, delivering the same request on a different afternoon, could be seized by guards before he reached the door and dragged to a cell in the tower. There was no pattern. There was no logic. The damaged brain generated responses based on stimuli that no external observer could predict or decode. Pain levels in the leg, the quality of sleep the previous night, a fleeting facial expression on a servant that the king's fractured perceptual system interpreted as mockery or contempt. The court learned very quickly that approaching the king without intelligence about his current state was an act of potentially fatal recklessness. And so the servants built a warning system. They tied colored ribbons to the iron rings mounted on the heavy oak doors of the king's private apartments. The colors were a code. Blue meant the pain was at a manageable level, and the king's mood was relatively stable. White meant he had retreated into one of his dark, melancholic silences, sitting motionless for hours, staring at nothing, unreachable, but not actively dangerous. Red meant the leg was in crisis. The pain was spiking beyond even his usual threshold. The brain damage was expressing itself in its most volatile form, and the king was actively looking for a target, any target, to absorb his fury. When the red ribbon appeared on the door, the palace emptied around it, like water retreating from a flame. Ministers who had urgent business suddenly discovered that their documents needed revision. Ambassadors scheduled for audiences sent word that they had fallen ill. The corridors surrounding the royal apartments went silent. The guards took their positions with their eyes fixed forward and their mouths sealed shut. The most powerful man in England sat alone in his reeking chambers, surrounded by stained cushions and bronze drainage bowls, attended only by the physicians who had no choice but to remain, and the ghosts of every person he had destroyed. While the reality behind the doors was decomposition and madness, the image projected to the outside world was the opposite. The Tudor propaganda machine worked without rest to manufacture an alternative version of Henry that could be exported to the courts of Europe and consumed by the English public. The centerpiece of this campaign was portraiture. Hans Holbein the Younger, the most technically gifted painter in Northern Europe, was commissioned to create the defining image of the king's later reign. The result was the Whitehall mural, a monumental painting installed in the king's private apartments that depicted Henry standing at full height with his legs planted wide apart in a posture of aggressive, unshakable physical dominance. His chest was inflated. His shoulders were thrown back. He wore layer upon layer of rich furs, heavy gold chains, and jeweled ornaments that projected wealth and power in every direction. His right hand rested on a polished wooden staff, the universal symbol of authority and self-sufficiency. The message was unmistakable. This was a man in absolute command of his body, his kingdom, and his destiny. Copies of the Holbein portrait were produced and distributed to diplomatic courts across Europe. The painting became the definitive visual representation of the Tudor monarchy, the image that ambassadors, foreign kings, and ordinary citizens used to form their mental picture of the English sovereign. It was, in every sense, the 16th century equivalent of a carefully engineered, state-sponsored digital fabrication. A deep fake rendered in oil and gold leaf. Centuries later, forensic art historians subjected surviving copies and preparatory sketches of the Holbein portraits to modern analytical techniques. They placed the aged wooden panels beneath X-ray scanners. The radiation passed through the surface layers of oil paint and penetrated down to the original underdrawing. The preliminary sketch that Holbein had laid down on the panel before applying color. And what the X-rays revealed beneath the finished surface was a detail that the Tudor government had specifically ordered to be erased. In the original underdrawing, Henry's right hand was not resting on a staff of authority. It was resting directly on top of a human skull. The artist knew. The man who spent hours in the king's presence, studying his face, measuring his proportions, observing the way he held himself and the way the court moved around him, Hans Holbein understood exactly what he was looking at. He was painting a man who was already dead in every way that mattered. And his instinct, captured in that first, unguarded sketch, was to place the universal symbol of mortality directly beneath the king's hand. The skull was the truth. The staff was the lie. And the government demanded the lie. The skull was painted over. The staff was rendered in its place. The portrait was finished, copied, and exported. And beneath the layers of carefully applied oil paint, the original vision of death remained, hidden but permanent, waiting for a technology that would not exist for another 400 years to finally bring it back into the light. You are watching a story reconstructed from documents that powerful men spent centuries trying to destroy. The medical journals, the diplomatic dispatches, the private letters that reveal the true biological horror of Henry's final decade were scattered across archives in 3 countries and suppressed by successive governments for generations. The primary source material used to build this script has been compiled into a single, comprehensive volume. Look at your screen right now. Click the View Products button. The book is available immediately. It is a relentless, day-by-day reconstruction of the Tudor cover-up, built entirely from original sources. This is not a summary. This is the raw archive. And while you are browsing, explore the curated collection of artifacts displayed alongside it. There are immersive historical treasures waiting for serious collectors of dark history. Open the shelf. Browse the vault. We are not finished. The architecture of deception held for 11 years. The widened doors concealed his size. The burning ambergris masked the stench of his decay. The colored ribbons protected the court from his neurological explosions. The Holbein portraits projected divine vitality to every throne room in Europe. The illusion was airtight. But biology does not respect political engineering. In the brutal winter of 1546, the microscopic war inside Henry's femur reached its final stage. The necrotic sludge that had been accumulating inside his bone for over a decade had consumed every available space. The fistulas on the surface of his legs could no longer drain the volume of infected material being produced. The pressure inside the bone became catastrophic. The infection, searching for a new path of escape, found one. A weakened capillary wall, eroded by years of bacterial assault, finally gave way. The microscopic organisms that had been trapped inside the localized battlefield of his femur poured directly into his bloodstream. The infection was no longer a leg wound. It was everywhere. The bacteria rode the current of his blood through his heart. They flooded into his liver. They reached his kidneys. They crossed the blood-brain barrier and entered the already damaged tissue of his cerebral cortex. Every major organ system in his body was now under simultaneous attack. The localized rot that had been contained, managed, and hidden for over a decade had become systemic sepsis. The king's body began to shut down. His skin took on the gray, waxy pallor of a man whose circulatory system was failing. His temperature spiked as his immune system launched a final, desperate, whole-body inflammatory response. His blood pressure dropped as the bacterial toxins destroyed the walls of his blood vessels from the inside. His kidneys, overwhelmed by the volume of toxins flooding through them, began to fail. His urine darkened. His abdomen swelled as fluid accumulated in spaces where it did not belong. The tyrant stopped screaming at his servants. He stopped issuing threats. He stopped raging at the physicians who cleaned his legs. For the first time in 11 years, the palace fell quiet around him. But the silence was not peace. The silence was the sound of a body surrendering. And in the fevered darkness of his final nights, the king began screaming at people who were not in the room. He called out to the dead. He argued with shadows. He begged forgiveness from faces that only he could see. The man who had sent 2 wives to the scaffold, who had butchered his most loyal servant, who had hung monks from the walls of their own monasteries and left them to rot in the English rain, was now trapped in a room with every ghost he had ever created. And the ghosts were not offering mercy. The blood-brain barrier is one of the most sophisticated defense systems in human biology. It is a semi-permeable membrane composed of tightly packed endothelial cells that line the blood vessels running through the central nervous system. Its sole purpose is to act as a gatekeeper, allowing essential nutrients to pass from the bloodstream into the brain while blocking pathogens, toxins, and foreign organisms from reaching the most critical organ in the body. For decades, this membrane had functioned flawlessly inside Henry's skull, even as the rest of his body disintegrated around it. It was the last wall standing between a dying king and total neurological collapse. In the final weeks of 1546, that wall fell. The bacterial load circulating through Henry's bloodstream had reached a concentration that no biological membrane could withstand. The organisms that had spent over a decade consuming the marrow inside his femur were now everywhere, riding the current of his blood through every artery, every vein, every capillary in his body. When they reached the vessels supplying his brain, they did not stop. They penetrated the weakened endothelial lining. They crossed into the cerebrospinal fluid. And once inside that fluid, they had unrestricted access to the most vulnerable tissue in the human body. Sepsis took hold of the king's brain. The bacterial toxins flooded through neural pathways that were already scarred and compromised from the original jousting injury a decade earlier. The brain tissue, already operating with catastrophic damage to the frontal lobe, began to swell inside the rigid vault of the skull. There was nowhere for the expanding tissue to go. Intracranial pressure climbed hour by hour, compressing the structures responsible for perception, memory, spatial awareness, and the ability to distinguish between what was real and what was not. The carefully maintained illusion of a functioning monarch, the performance that the Privy Council had sustained through widened doors, burning ambergris, colored ribbons, and state-commissioned portraits, collapsed in real time. Henry was no longer merely volatile, unpredictable, or dangerous. He had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. The King of England had become detached from reality itself. During a formal state banquet in the Great Hall at Whitehall Palace, it happened in front of everyone. The long wooden tables were laid with the full ceremonial display of Tudor power. Silver plates gleamed beneath candlelight. Platters of roasted swan, dressed peacock, and heavily spiced game meats lined the center of each table. Goblets of imported wine stood at every place setting. The most powerful men in England sat in their assigned positions, dressed in their finest doublets, performing the ritual of courtly dining that had governed English political life for generations. Foreign ambassadors occupied the seats of honor. The room was full. The atmosphere was controlled, formal, and meticulously staged. And then the king began shouting at an empty chair. Every conversation in the hall died simultaneously. Forks stopped moving. Goblets were lowered to the table in silence. Every pair of eyes in the room turned toward the massive figure of the king, seated at the head of the banquet on his reinforced throne, his infected legs propped on cushions beneath the table, his swollen body wrapped in layers of fur and jeweled fabric. He was staring at a chair across from him, a chair in which no one was sitting. Henry was arguing with his dead father. He called out to Henry VII by name. His voice carried across the stone walls of the Great Hall with the force of a man accustomed to being heard in every corner of every room he entered. He demanded answers. He accused his father of failures. He shouted grievances that had been buried for decades. Then his tone shifted. It cracked. The rage dissolved into something far more disturbing. He began crying out for his mother, Elizabeth of York, who had died when Henry was 11 years old. He begged her to come to him. He pleaded for her protection. He told her there were enemies in the shadows. He told her they were coming for him, and he could not stop them alone. The ambassadors sat frozen. The courtiers did not breathe. The 400-pound monarch thrashed against his velvet cushions, his bloated hands gripping the arms of his throne, his yellowing eyes scanning corners of the room that contained nothing but candlelight and stone. He pointed at empty spaces along the walls with swollen, trembling fingers. He screamed at the ghost of Anne Boleyn. He ordered her to stop staring at him. He commanded her to look away. He demanded that the guards remove her from the hall immediately. The guards stood at their posts along the perimeter of the room. Their halberds were held at rigid attention. Their faces were blank. They did not move. There was no one to arrest. There was no one to remove. The woman the king was screaming at had been dead for 10 years. Her head had been separated from her body on a scaffold inside the Tower of London on a spring morning in 1536. And now she was standing in the corner of the banquet hall, visible only to the man who had signed her death warrant, staring at him from across a decade of silence. The political elite of England were trapped in their seats. Every man at those tables held his position, his lands, his freedom, and his life at the pleasure of the screaming figure at the head of the room. They were watching a man who possessed absolute, unchecked authority over every person in the kingdom wage a war against opponents who did not exist. The situation was not merely terrifying. It was legally impossible to navigate. If any man at those tables acknowledged what he was witnessing, if he spoke a single word suggesting that the king was mad, He had committed treason under the very laws Henry himself had enacted. The Treason Act made it a capital offense to question the king's fitness to rule. To speak of his illness was to die, but to sit in silence and pretend that a raving, hallucinating 400-pound monarch screaming at ghosts in a banquet hall was behaving normally was to become an accomplice in a deception so vast that it threatened to consume everyone within its radius. So they did the only thing they could do. They stared at their silver plates. They kept their hands flat on the table. They waited for the episode to exhaust itself. And when the king's voice finally broke into a hoarse, ragged whisper and his massive body slumped back against the cushions, they resumed eating. No one spoke of what they had seen. Not that night. Not ever. By January 1547, the systemic infection had moved beyond the king's brain and into the final organs still capable of sustaining his life. The human liver is the body's central processing plant. It filters toxins from the blood. It metabolizes nutrients. It produces the bile necessary for digestion. It is one of the most resilient organs in the body, capable of regenerating from remarkable levels of damage. Henry's liver had been under bacterial assault for weeks. The sepsis had infiltrated the hepatic tissue and destroyed its cellular architecture from the inside. The organ failed. It could no longer filter the bilirubin, the yellow pigment produced by the breakdown of red blood cells, from his blood. The bilirubin accumulated in his tissues. His skin, already gray and waxy from circulatory collapse, took on a deep, sickly yellow hue. The jaundice spread across his face, his hands, his chest, turning the king the color of old parchment. His kidneys followed. These organs, responsible for filtering waste products from the bloodstream and excreting them as urine, could not withstand the volume of bacterial toxins flooding through them. They shut down. Uric acid and other metabolic waste products that should have been expelled from his body accumulated in his blood instead. The whites of his eyes, already bloodshot and strained, darkened to a pale, bruised shade of mustard yellow. His urine, in the final days that his kidneys produced any at all, turned the color of dark amber and carried an odor that physicians described as unlike anything they had encountered. His digestive system ceased functioning entirely. The smooth muscle contractions that move food through the intestines, a process called peristalsis, stopped. His bowels became motionless. The contents of his digestive tract sat in his abdomen and began to ferment. His tongue, deprived of adequate blood flow and moisture, swelled inside his mouth. It turned dry and cracked. The surface darkened to black. When the king exhaled, his breath carried a stench that combined the smell of human feces with the unmistakable odor of decomposing meat. The bacteria had conquered every internal territory. They had colonized every organ system. The king's body was no longer a living organism fighting an infection. It was a landscape being consumed. Then came the stroke. A massive blood clot formed in the sluggish, toxin-saturated rivers of his failing circulatory system, broke free from wherever it had lodged and traveled through his vascular network until it reached his brain. It wedged itself into a cerebral artery and blocked the flow of blood to an entire hemisphere. The right side of his face collapsed. The muscles went slack. His right eyelid drooped. The corner of his mouth sagged downward. The right half of his body became paralyzed. His right arm fell to his side and did not move again. His right leg, already destroyed by a decade of osteomyelitis, lost whatever residual sensation it still possessed. The King of England lay in his enormous wooden bed, a jaundiced, swollen, half-paralyzed figure pinned to the mattress by his own failing biology, unable to lift his own hand. And yet, even as his nervous system disintegrated around him, the sociopathic architecture of his damaged brain remained functional to the very end. Thomas Howard, the Duke of Norfolk, was locked in a cell in the Tower of London. He had been arrested on charges of treason and was awaiting execution. Norfolk was one of the most powerful noblemen in England, a man whose family had served the crown for generations. Henry wanted him dead. Not because Norfolk posed an immediate political threat, not because the evidence against him was overwhelming, but because the king's deteriorating brain had identified him as a target, and the neural circuits that might once have allowed for reconsideration, for mercy, for a weighing of consequences, were long since destroyed. Henry wanted the death warrant signed before his crown passed to his 9-year-old son, Edward. He wanted Norfolk's head removed from his body as one of the final acts of his reign. The scribes were summoned to the bedchamber. They placed the parchment on the king's chest, resting it on the stained linen that covered his bloated torso. They placed a quill in his right hand. Henry tried to grip the feather. His fingers would not respond. The stroke had severed the connection between his brain's intention and his hand's ability to execute. He could not close his fist around the shaft of the quill. He could not form a single letter of his own name. The man who had signed thousands of death warrants, who had authorized the execution of 2 of his own wives, who had sent his closest friend and most loyal minister to a butchered death on a scaffold, was physically incapable of performing the one act his broken mind still demanded. His advisors improvised. They produced a dry stamp, a mechanical device that had been created as a tool of administrative convenience. It was a metal mold cast in the exact shape of the king's signature. They pressed it onto the parchment, transferring the imprint of a name that the living hand of the king could no longer write. The warrant was stamped. Norfolk's execution was authorized by a machine. The king's final act of cruelty was performed by a piece of metal because his own body had refused to cooperate. Norfolk survived only because Henry died first. The execution was scheduled for the morning of January 28th. Henry stopped breathing hours before the axe could fall. The end came in the deepest hours of that January night. Archbishop Thomas Cranmer was dragged from his bed by a royal messenger and told to ride immediately to Whitehall. Cranmer mounted his horse and rode through the freezing, empty streets of London in darkness. The cold was brutal. His breath crystallized in the air in front of his face. The hooves of his horse echoed off the cobblestones of streets that had no other sound. When Cranmer entered the king's bedchamber, the smell hit him like a physical wall. Every account that survives from that night describes the stench in the room as total. It was not merely the smell of infection or decay. It was the smell of a body in which every organ had failed, every internal system had collapsed, and every fluid had begun the process of decomposition while the heart still faintly beat. It was the smell of biological surrender. Cranmer's private accounts, written in the weeks that followed and preserved against all odds in the archives of the English Church, describe the horror of those final hours in language that betrays a man struggling to process what his senses were reporting. The king could no longer speak. His swollen tongue and paralyzed facial muscles had eliminated any capacity for articulate sound. His body was seized by violent physical convulsions, his massive frame shaking uncontrollably against the wooden frame of the bed. Between the seizures, he began to vomit. The fluid that erupted from his mouth was not food. It was black bile, a term the physicians used for what modern medicine identifies as digested blood. Stress ulcers in the lining of his stomach, caused by the catastrophic physiological collapse of septic shock, had eroded through the stomach wall and were bleeding into his digestive tract. The blood was partially digested by the stomach acid before being expelled, turning it into a thick, dark, coffee ground textured fluid. that stained the white linen sheets beneath him in spreading black pools. Cranmer knelt beside the bed. He leaned close to the king's face. He asked Henry to give some sign, any sign, that he placed his trust in God and died in the faith of Christ. The king could not nod. He could not speak. He could not open his eyes. The only part of his body that still responded to conscious command was his left hand. He found Cranmer's fingers in the darkness and squeezed. It was the last voluntary action Henry VIII ever performed. Minutes later, the contractions of his heart became irregular. The intervals between beats lengthened. And then, sometime in the early hours of January 28, 1547, the heart stopped entirely. Henry VIII was dead, but the machinery of state deception did not stop with him. It accelerated. The Privy Council sealed the doors of the bedchamber immediately. Edward Seymour and William Paget, the two men best positioned to control the transition of power, took command of the palace. They made a decision that would have been considered treason under the very laws Henry had created. They hid the death of the king. For 3 full days, no announcement was made. No bells were rung. No black cloth was draped from the windows of Whitehall. The King of England was dead in his bed, and the government pretended he was still alive. The reason was political survival. Henry's heir was Edward, a 9-year-old boy. The transfer of power to a child regent was one of the most dangerous moments any monarchy could face. Rival factions would mobilize. Foreign powers would probe for weakness. The men who controlled the transition controlled the future. Seymour and Paget needed time. Time to secure the treasury. Time to position their allies. Time to draft the documents that would place themselves at the center of the new Regency government. So they forced the palace to perform a grotesque theatrical production. The royal kitchens continued to prepare meals. Trays of food were loaded with roasted meats, fresh bread, and pitchers of wine. Servants carried these trays down the corridors of Whitehall with the same choreographed formality they had practiced for years. They delivered the food to the sealed doors of the king's chambers. The trays were taken inside. The food was never eaten. It sat in the room with the corpse, growing cold on silver plates, while the body on the bed continued its decomposition. Trumpets were blown at the appointed hours to signal the king's waking and his retirement for the evening. The sounds echoed through the palace as if the man who had terrorized England for nearly 4 decades was simply beginning another ordinary day. The government had turned the court into a puppet theater, and the puppet was a 400-pound cadaver sealed behind a locked oak door. While the council forged documents and consolidated power in the adjoining rooms, the royal surgeons were given the task that no one envied. They had to prepare the body of Henry VIII for a state funeral. The embalmers entered the sealed bedchamber with their instruments. They carried iron-cutting tools, bronze scooping implements, bags of salt and alum, bundles of linen, blocks of beeswax, and armloads of aromatic spices. The standard procedure for royal embalming in the 16th century was a process called evisceration. The torso would be opened. The internal organs would be removed, cleaned, and placed in separate containers. The body cavity would be packed with preservative materials. The exterior would be wrapped, sealed, and placed in the coffin for transport and burial. When the surgeons cut into Henry's abdomen, they discovered that standard procedure was no longer possible. The weeks of systemic sepsis had not merely damaged his internal organs, it had liquefied them. The liver, which should have been a firm, dense structure weighing several pounds, had degraded into a soft, formless mass that disintegrated at the touch. The intestines had lost their structural integrity. The stomach was perforated by the stress ulcers that had caused the black vomiting in his final hours. The entire abdominal cavity was filled with a slurry of decomposed organ tissue, bacterial fluid, and partially coagulated blood. There was nothing to remove intact. There was nothing to clean and preserve in a ceremonial vessel. The surgeons improvised. They used bronze scoops to remove as much of the liquefied viscera as they could extract from the cavity. They packed the hollowed chest and abdomen with over 100 pounds of coarse salt and powdered alum, minerals they believed would absorb the remaining fluids and slow the decomposition process. They wrapped the enormous body in layer after layer of cerecloth, linen fabric that had been soaked in melted beeswax to create an airtight seal around the remains. Finally, they placed the wrapped body into a custom-built coffin lined with lead. The lead shell was soldered shut with molten metal, sealing the king's remains inside what the embalmers believed would be an impenetrable container. They were confident that the heavy metal lining would trap the decomposition gases and contain the biological processes occurring inside. They did not understand the chemistry of what was about to happen. In February 1547, the funeral procession departed London. A massive wooden cart, reinforced with iron wheels and pulled by teams of black-draped horses, carried the lead coffin along the muddy winter roads toward Windsor Castle, where Henry would be interred in the vault he had prepared for himself. The journey covered roughly 25 miles. The winter roads were thick with frozen mud that turned to deep, sucking mire wherever the weak winter sun managed to soften the surface. The procession moved at a crawl. The journey took 2 full days. On the first night, the procession halted at Sion Abbey. The choice of resting place carried a weight that no one in the funeral party could have missed. Sion Abbey was not a neutral location. It was a site stained with the personal cruelty of the man whose body now rested inside its walls. Years earlier, Henry had targeted this specific monastery during his dissolution of the religious houses. He had stripped its wealth. He had expelled its monks. He had executed members of its order. And then, in a final act of calculated desecration, he had converted the sacred space into a temporary prison for his 5th wife, Catherine Howard, in the weeks before she was taken to the Tower and beheaded. The holy sanctuary, where generations of monks had prayed and studied and lived in devotion to God, had been turned into a holding cell for a doomed queen by the same king whose corpse now occupied its chapel. The coffin was placed in the nave of the Abbey church. The temperature outside dropped well below freezing. Inside the soldered lead shell, a biological process was accelerating beyond anything the embalmers had anticipated. The surgeons had not been able to remove all of the necrotic tissue from the body. The salt and alum packed into the cavity had absorbed some of the surface moisture, but they could not reach the deep bacterial colonies still embedded in the remaining flesh, in the marrow of the bones, in the tissue that the scoops had failed to extract. In the sealed anaerobic darkness inside the coffin, these bacteria continued to do what they had been doing for over a decade. They consumed, they metabolized, and as they consumed the remaining organic material, they produced gas, methane, hydrogen sulfide, carbon dioxide. The chemical byproducts of decomposition accumulated inside the lead shell with nowhere to go. The pressure inside the coffin began to climb, hour by hour. The lead walls, strong but not infinitely so, began to deform under the internal force. The flat surfaces bulged outward. The soldered seams, designed to hold against the modest internal pressures of a properly embalmed body, strained against forces they were never engineered to contain. Sometime after midnight, in the frozen silence of the desecrated abbey, the structural integrity of the coffin failed. The leads split open. The pressurized contents of the coffin erupted through the breach. A shock wave of superheated sulfurous gas blasted outward and hit the stone walls of the chapel. The liquefied remains of the King of England, a pressurized slurry of decomposed tissue, bacterial waste, dissolved fat, and the remnants of the salt packing sprayed across the floor of the nave. The stench was instantaneous and overwhelming. It was the concentrated essence of biological decomposition compressed into a single explosive release. Guards stationed outside the chapel doors staggered backward. Several of them gagged and fled their posts entirely, abandoning the king's body to the freezing darkness. The invisible cloud of methane and hydrogen sulfide that filled the chapel was dense enough to make breathing dangerous. The royal plumbers were summoned at first light to repair the damage. When they arrived at the chapel carrying their soldering irons, lead patches, and tools, they stopped in the doorway. The scene inside the nave was something none of them had been prepared to witness. Stray dogs had entered the chapel through the doors left open by the fleeing guards during the night. The animals had been drawn by the smell. They were gathered around the shattered coffin and across the floor of the nave, crouched low, their muzzles pressed to the cold stone, licking the dark, infected fluids that had pooled between the cobblestones. The biological remains of Henry VIII, the man who had declared himself the supreme authority over the Church of England, who had reshaped the theological landscape of an entire continent, who had executed wives and ministers and monks and citizens with the casual indifference of a man swatting insects, were being consumed by stray dogs on the floor of a monastery he had desecrated. This is where the terror of the Tudor reign ended. Not on a battlefield, not in a throne room, not in the pages of a heroic chronicle written by flattering historians. It ended in a freezing chapel in the middle of the night, with the exploded remains of a tyrant being licked off the floor by animals that had wandered in from the cold. The man who had forced an entire nation to worship him as the voice of God on earth was reduced, in his final hours above ground, to a biological hazard being cleaned up by frightened servants armed with sawdust and quicklime. Nature does not recognize crowns. Bacteria do not kneel. The body of a king decomposes at exactly the same rate and by exactly the same chemical processes as the body of the poorest peasant who ever worked his fields. Henry spent his reign constructing an elaborate mythology of divine invincibility. He spent 11 years forcing a nation to pretend that his rotting body was the sacred vessel of God's chosen ruler. And in the end, biology did what no army, no pope, no rebellion, and no act of parliament ever could. It stripped away every lie. It dissolved every illusion. It reduced the most powerful man in England to the same raw materials as every other organism that has ever lived and died on this earth. The dogs did not know they were eating a king. They were just hungry. Thank you for staying until the very end. If this reached you, subscribe, leave a like, and share this video with someone who deserves to hear the truth history tried to bury. You have just watched another premium documentary by Ancestral, your ultimate dark history destination on YouTube. Click the video appearing on your screen right now. Watch it immediately. Continue your descent into the past. The next story is waiting.